I'm Trish FitzSimons, and it's my huge pleasure to be here today. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. So, during the 19th century, the huge expansion of sheep pastoralism in Australia, New Zealand, the Western United States, South Africa, South America, and in less predictable locales like the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, and Rapa Nui, Easter Island, fueled the alienation of indigenous peoples from their lands. The sheep and their wool, at the heart of these grass wars, fed a global industry that supported another kind of war, the mass cold climate warfare characterising the century between the Crimean and Korean wars. This paper examines one aspect of our larger project, Fabric of War, the global wool trade from Crimea to Korea. It will reference indigenous peoples in many parts of the world. Respect is offered to those peoples and their elders past, present and emerging, and to the elders of this unceded land on which we meet. Today's presentation and the associated paper are to a degree broad brushstrokes, with examples only from Australasia, the Pacific and North America. We reckon, however, that the connections we make and the political and economic logic linking these case studies are cogent and fresh. The impact of war is much greater than the loss of life of combatants and civilian suffering. There are far-reaching economic and social effects. This slide lists just a fraction of the wars that scarred the social fabric between the mid-19th and mid-20th centuries. The grass wars that are our main focus in this paper today don't appear, for instance. Few parts of the globe were free from armed conflict, and in many cases repeated conflicts during that 100 years, the same period that saw the emergence of a truly global wool trade.
Which came first? The industrialization of wool textile production, or the rapid spread of sheep farming through newly colonized lands, or the massive need for woolen fabrics used in military clothing and bedding. The huge expansion of sheep pastoralism was both a response to and a facilitator of the concomitant growth in the factory production of wool. While cotton textile manufacture drove the Industrial Revolution from the mid-18th century, not until the second quarter of the 19th century did mechanization and factory organization meet with the efforts of sheep breeders to create the long, springy staples that would be more easily factory processed. These conditions transformed wool manufacture in stages from a cottage industry to full industrialization. The distribution of sheep within its empire, the importance of English sheep breeds to industry, and the leading role of Bradford in West Yorkshire as a woolen textile producing city led to British imperial leadership in wool production, not only in its colonial territories, but in locations that were not necessarily British by nationality, but driven by British capital and production systems. The largest producers of woolen goods, which included the US, the UK, Germany, France, and eventually Japan, could not rely on domestic fleece to fill their manufacturing needs, and imported heavily from British-controlled wool markets. This provoked a complex politics of wool during wartime. One starting point of our larger project, Fabric of War, is that an array of military uniforms from all combatant nations in the first 6 or 12 months of any war between Crimea in the 1850s and Korea in the 1950s might reasonably contain wool fibers imported from one or more of the newly important sheep-raising regions. And this is because after about a year, you no longer have your pre-war stocks and you don't trade with the enemy. But at what cost on a local scale was this global growth, both to local populations and to the ecologies they had previously inhabited? The alienation of local populations from land in favor of sheep was not unknown before the industrialization of both wool and war began to take shape. And it did not only affect the first peoples of newly colonized regions. The Scottish Highland clearances were a series of actions taken for more than a century after 1750 by absentee landlords to remove crofters from their farms and replace them with sheep. Donald MacLeod, who lived through the Sutherland clearances in the early 19th century, whose quotation is here, wrote in 1840 of the connection between the Napoleonic Wars and the clearances, stressing that the interruption of trade prompted landowners to prefer raising profitable animals for a national market to leasing small crofts for local self-sufficiency. As MacLeod explains, the exigencies of war threw Britain back solely on domestic resources. This will foreshadow Germany's position during the two world wars to come. Lands perceived by colonial powers as empty or inhabited by cultures that treated land and its resources differently than Western European colonizers were subsumed into pastoral activity, often sheep first and then cattle, in a variety of modes of colonization, displacement, adaptation, and exploitation. The Scots, for example, over the decades of the clearances, became in many regions, New Zealand, Australia, other places, a first wave of colonists who in turn displaced others.
And in that, I ought to note that two of my grandparents were Scottish and I am settler, Australian. So, European settlement in Australia began in the late 18th century. This European invasion was based on the concept of terra nullius, empty land. No treaty nor any form of native title was offered to the continent's Aboriginal nations until much later. At first, these invading settlers used sheep more as meat than as sources of wool fibre. Arriving in 1794, Samuel Marsden combined missionary duties with sheep husbandry, breeding sheep to survive the Australian environment, feed a populace that would not eat kangaroo, and also provide wool. In 1809, Marsden, raised in the West Riding of Yorkshire, sent the first Australian-grown wool back to Britain. Wool was the ideal commodity for Australia, far from European markets, as it could be transported without obvious deterioration. Within a few decades, economic prosperity based on wool was more important than food security to the European colonists. It had a different impact on the Aboriginal peoples that had inhabited the continent with their own economies and cultures for tens of thousands of years. From the 1830s, so-called squatters, white European settlers who moved beyond the established boundaries of the various Australian colonies, took up vast swathes of the continent, building large sheep holdings and regularly dispersing Aboriginal people along the way. Frontier land wars, or grass wars, were the result. Aboriginal people suffered, both through massacres and through the ecological devastation of sheep marching west and north from the coastal European colonies. The herd's hard hooves and capacity to eat right to the ground destroyed plants, such as yams, vital to the Aboriginal diet. After the gold rushes of the... Oh, I don't know where that came from. After the gold rushes of the 1850s left the land largely without a non-Aboriginal workforce, however, Aboriginal people became central to the success of sheep pastoralism, although labour conditions were very poor and their rights were not protected. One example is a strike of 800 Aboriginal pastoral workers in the Pilbara region of northwestern West Australia. Began in 1945, went on for years and was never truly resolved. In New Zealand, differences in the environment, in human habitation patterns, and in the timing and forms of colonial settlement led to outcomes for New Zealand's first peoples in relation to sheep and wool, distinctively different from Australia. The Polynesian Maori settled Aotearoa late in the 13th century. Their pattern of sedentary villages, underpinned by hunting and contained vegetable gardens, was recognised by Europeans as a form of land tenure, unlike the Aboriginal culture and economy in Australia. The British government and many Maori chiefs signed the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. There were innumerable problems with this treaty, but even so, the Maori were generally better off than Aboriginal peoples of Australia. The wool industry in New Zealand began in the 1840s in the Wairarapa, a high plateau to the east of the first European settlement in Wellington. Land for this purpose was leased from the Maori, which John McGibbon, a historian of the New Zealand wool industry, says that many Maori embraced and profited from. The merino sheep that were at the heart of the Australian industry, with their fine wool and capacity to endure tough, dry conditions, were only ever able to survive in a small part of New Zealand. Rather, New Zealand's industry was about mixed farms, with both meat and wool as primary commodities, and based on strong-wooled Romney crossbreds. As in Australia, however, once sheep were established as basic to New Zealand's economy, Maori labour became central to the industry, especially as shearers. On Rapa Nui, Easter Island in the Pacific, in the late 19th century, the Scottish-Chilean company Williamson Balfour was the driving force, leasing the island not from its inhabitants, but from the Chilean government. The company's commercial base in shipping was central to the profitability of this particular enterprise. The islanders had been severely reduced in number by slaving raids from Peru in the 1860s and by disease. This made it easy to confine them, some would say imprison, in the fenced-in town of Whangaroa, when their labour was not required, while the sheep roamed free on the island. The ecology was drastically altered, with the native plants destroyed by the grazing sheep and replaced by feed grasses from Australia.
Before the 1850s, the Hawaiian Islands had few sheep, descendants of those dropped off more or less in passing as food sources by explorers or whalers. Not until what is called the Great Mahele of 1848, in which the system of land tenure was fundamentally changed to allow foreigners to purchase land, did ranching become an important economic driver in the islands. Hawaiian wool, for example, was purchased during the American Civil War by the Stevens Woolen Mills in Massachusetts, manufacturing textiles for the Union Army. As the sheep herds grew, native plants, as in other places, were replaced by imported fodder species. And as in Australia and New Zealand, indigenous peoples, as well as new immigrants of color, became the wool industry's workforce. Hawaii's sheep ranches included the Parker Ranch on the Big Island, which subsumed several smaller holdings and ran sheep into the 1920s, and the entire island of Niihau, which was purchased by the Sinclair family, immigrants from Scotland via New Zealand in 1853. They actually came to Oregon after they left New Zealand and decided it was too dangerous in Oregon, so they went back to Hawaii. They moved about half of the 500 indigenous inhabitants off the island and all the dogs, and that left the land clear for their flock by 1885, about 40,000 sheep, and they ran that into the 1950s. Just as sheep followed European colonizers to the eastern seaboard of North America and up from South America to the North American Southwest, settlers were moving further west from the East Coast took sheep with them, the flocks growing in size and the scale of the land they required increasing with each subsequent move. One of many stories, and boy are there many, in the American West, follows the introduction of sheep into Indian treaty lands in Oregon and Idaho. A combination of manifest destiny ideology and the discovery of gold in the 1860s led white settlers to move into the mountain country of eastern Oregon, and they brought their sheep and cattle with them. A disputed treaty in 1863 and the Nez Perce War of 1877 diminished reservation lands from 7.5 million acres to fewer than 1 million, and finally by 1890 to 150,000. In 1891, the U.S. Congress passed the Forest Reserves Act. This brought many acres under federal control for the leasing of various rights, including grazing rights. And in 1906, the remaining reservation Nez Perce, who had by custom used those lands for seasonal hunting and grazing were now required to apply for permits to do so. Another kind of grass war erupted in the American West, range wars in which sheepmen and cattlemen fought bitterly over access to grazing lands. There's lots of sheep bones from a massacre of sheep in this photograph there. But in the end, it wasn't the range wars that affected sheep raising on the western ranges. Price increases for wool during World Wars I and II led sheepmen to believe at first that prosperity would follow in light of how much wool the army would need for uniforms and blankets and the shortage of supplies. But overgrazing during the First War limited production. And in the Second, the armed forces took away the manpower required to guard the sheep from predators, to drive the flocks across the ranges, and to see to the shearing and shipping of the wool. So Oregon's experience is just one example. It's important to note, though, that the U.S. could not support its wool consumption even in peacetime, and supply lines to the lands that had wool to sell were long and hazardous in wartime. The American Civil War has been called the first industrialized war. The United States Army soared from under 20,000 men in 1860 to encompass more than 2 million by 1865. Clothing and equipping them properly was a constant anxiety, and the Confederate Army fared even worse. A decade earlier, the Crimean War, which pitted France, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire against Russia, engaged more than 1.5 million soldiers, and about 1 million died, most from disease and exposure. Historian Andrew Lambert states that the armies fought in uniforms and with tactics from the Napoleonic era, but faced innovations in weapons, transportation, and communications. The memory of the ill-clad troops who fought those two wars haunted the military establishments of many nations for decades and was a concern in every war through the Korean conflict. Various national memories of this shortages of wool were yet another deep local factor in the strategic importance of access to wool supplies. In the long run, this would drive industry and the military to investigate substitutes and synthetics sourced from locally available materials, including shoddy, which was mentioned before. For more on these points, please come to our Fabric of War film screenings tomorrow at Rikinansa. A little plug. This is a great photograph. And if you come to the film, you'll understand why it's up there too. So the history of the trade in raw wool is usually told within a series of national or at most imperial stories. This separation, however, ignores the fact that wool is intrinsically a transnational commodity. The 19th and early 20th century expansion of sheep pastoralism in many parts of the globe was stimulated by the settler society's needs, not only for meat, but for a primary product for trade, and by the demand for woolen textiles by growing populations. These, in turn, prompted increasing capacity of industrial woolen mills in Europe, Britain, America, and by 1900, again, Japan. And as textile manufacturing industrialized, so did warfare, with armies getting larger and requiring ever more from stretched supply chains. This expansion also created conflict, often armed, sometimes deadly, over the land that made it possible, damaging the societies that were displaced by sheep and altering the environments that they inhabited. So given our 20-minute time frame, please forgive our omissions today. It has not been possible to negotiate with all the various indigenous groups about their representation, and obviously we have not addressed South Africa and South America. The topic is complex beyond our original expectations. So we really invite partners, both in the research and in the outcomes of the project. Thank you.